Anxiety can make your inner world so noisy that it becomes impossible to hear what you actually need.
Today on Mastering Change, we're joined by Jamie Clements, a breathwork educator who explains how working with the breath can directly shift the nervous system and how it became central to his own recovery.
He shares why breath is one of the most accessible tools for regulation and self-connection. He talks about micro and macro model that uses breath for both daily nervous system support and for deeper shifts in awareness. And what we cover here is the importance, just like with other interventions, for the right preparation and integration post the work.
I thought it was a really fascinating conversation, and I love talking about the breath because it's so obviously accessible to us all. And I'm really excited because Jamie's coming to Oxford this year, and he is going to do something we've never done before, which is a huge group breathwork session. There's something about the energy of doing something like this in a group, and it's one thing to do it in a group of sort of 10, 20 people max, but having 200 people doing a breathwork session, I think it's going to be something really magical about it. So I'm really looking forward to both Oxford and this conversation with Jamie.
So my name is Jamie Clements. I am the founder of a business called The Breath Space. I'm a breathwork educator, facilitator, and speaker.
And so Jamie, I'd be really interested in knowing how you got into this space. How come you ended up in creating a business called Breathwork?
Absolutely. So I say at this point, kind of unsurprisingly, this hasn't been my kind of life's work. It wasn't my career. It's very much my life's work now. But I have a degree in economics. I played semi-professional rugby growing up. I started working in the city. I had a very brief stint in private banking and corporate finance very early on in my university career, and then moved into the world of technology startups and high growth kind of venture-backed startups. And from the outside looking in, very functional, very functioning, very, very miserable, very, very lost. And my late teens, from about the age of 15 through to my early 20s, up until I was about 24, 25, were marked behind the scenes by severe anxiety, depression, and panic attacks in my early 20s. So I was at a point in my early 20s where I was having near daily panic attacks, suicidal ideation. I was in a very, very dark place at that point in my life. And I had a bit of a perfect storm of all perfect storms where that was going on for me personally. I then lost a job, lost a friend from school to suicide, and really just dropped deeper into that kind of rock bottom myself, and ticked off the list of all of the things that one should try if you're struggling with your mental health. So it was exercise, yoga, therapy, the usual suspects. And I was practicing yoga at a studio near where I lived at the time. And the owner of that studio said, "Oh, we've got this one breathwork session every week." And I did what I've seen on the other side now happen many, many times. What on earth is that? What do I need to learn about breathing? And eventually kind of took myself there really from a place of desperation and needing it. And that set me off on the journey of the last 8.5, 9 years, where that initial thread really unraveled and unfurled, and breathwork became the linchpin as a part of the puzzle that really unlocked my experience of life and my experience of my mental health. I was near daily panic attacks for about 4 years. I've not had a panic attack in 7.5 years. And I put a lot of that down to breathwork. And beyond, I suppose, symptom management and symptom prevention, which was sort of the first unlock for me, it really has connected me back to myself. And you mentioned before we came on air, kind of this seat of awareness that sits behind our ego mind, our finite mind, and really connected me back to what I, in the language, would refer to as my soul. And that for me is that deeper sense of self. When I was in my early teens, sort of 13, 14, I was fascinated by human nature, by psychology, by why we do the things we do. And that is where I've come almost full circle back around to. It's something that I'm fascinated by, continue to be fascinated by. And yeah, it was that path of self-healing that led me to a desire and a purpose, which for me is to share this work, and ultimately to grow the category of breathwork is really at the core of everything that I'm trying to do.
And so at the core of that breathwork piece, there's lots of different methodologies and approaches, and there's evidence bases around. But where did you start on that? So you're saying that you started in a yoga studio gives me a strong sense of what that might have been, but explain to us what type of breath work.
For sure. So actually probably not what's in your mind, not the realms of pranayama as a starting point. It was actually what I would refer to as sort of going in at the deep end. It was high ventilation, Wim Hof-esque conscious connected breathwork practice. So yeah, quite a deep, intense practice. And while as a facilitator, I'm now pretty mindful around where I start people on their breathwork journey, and that's probably not where I would start most people. It was a very impactful starting point for me as a very heady, intellectual, closed-minded young man, because it just dropped me into my body in a way that I had never experienced. You know, it was sensation, it was feeling, it was everything coming back online, and it really just switched something on in me that I'm very grateful for, because it stuck. And I think that was the most profound thing for me at the time.
I have a question about something you said before Emma's question, which was basically you were disconnected from yourself, your kind of what you call the soul. Why do you think and I think it's something to do with dropping yourself back into your body, but how does that disconnect come about, and how does that disconnect then cause panic attacks or the anxiety states? And I guess then leading into how the breathwork and the science of breathwork stops that or helps that.
Yeah, a really great question. I'm of a way of thinking now at this point in my life and my career that I view a lot of the symptoms that we list, so things like anxiety or insomnia or low mood, I view a lot of these things as, of course, valid and real experiences of life for people, but they are for me symptomatic of that disconnect from self. And so I kind of view it as you have soul and self as this kind of core light of your being over the period of time, more actually like a central path, I suppose. And if you allow yourself to, consciously or otherwise, be pulled off of that path, it is creating this tension. If you imagine like an elastic band pulling away from that central sense of self, it's creating more and more tension the further away you stray from that. And that tension forms suffering, that forms these symptoms that we all experience. And for me, contextually, my parents separated when I was 15. I fell into this, without going into all of the depths of it, this familiar pattern for a lot of people of desperately wanting to fit in. I molded myself, I shaped myself to fit in whichever way I could. And in doing so, stopped listening to what is true for me and how do I want to live my life, but more how should I be living my life in order to facilitate that fitting in. And that then showed up for me in the form that it did through anxiety and through that presentation within the nervous system of that chronic stress, that chronic activation. And so I think there are aspects of lifestyle and how I was living my life, living on autopilot, really functioning just at that level, but then also that deeper layer of just being pulled away from myself. And so that's how I look at my experience and how I look at, I guess, piecing all of these elements together. The role of the breath for me and where this all comes together is really looking at two stages, two phases, which is the breath is an incredibly powerful tool to address those symptoms. So if we think about anxiety, if we think about the nervous system, we can use the breath as a direct route into shifting the state of the nervous system through the autonomic nervous system. So in the case of anxiety, we can use the breath to decrease activation and energy within the system and mitigate and alleviate anxiety there and then. So we can really work on the symptoms at that level. And then as we go a little bit deeper into these experiences of non-ordinary states of consciousness, of mystical experiences through the breath and conscious connected breathing, we actually start to go a little deeper. We actually start to have some of these unveiling experiences where we connect to that deep felt sense of self. And so we can kind of go phase one of symptom management and addressing that, incredibly effective, incredibly powerful, incredibly impactful. But also as we start to go a little bit deeper, and it fascinates me because if we look at every ancient wisdom tradition, their word for spirit, their word for life force, their word for vitality is also their word for breath. And it's just in the Western world, we seem to have this deep disconnect from that sense that breath is consciousness, breath is life force. And so through that lens, we're able to connect back to our own sense of that infinite consciousness within us through working more deeply with our breath and some of these expanded states of being.
So that misalignment that you had, so when you were living your life in ways that were obviously not aligned to your true purpose and not aligned to your real, true, authentic self, I guess. First of all, you went through the symptom management part of the breathwork, so you could obviously release yourself from the anxiety and the states of suicidal ideation, etc., which is helpful to, well, very helpful to like function just generally. But then, are you saying that it was through kind of deeper exploration of through breathwork that you were able to connect to what, what was how you were living your life incorrectly and how to live your life correctly? So these kind of really deep philosophical questions that so many of us kind of ask when we're lost on the path of, am I doing the right thing? Am I, what's the purpose of my life? Why am I here? Kind of those kind of questions. Is that something that this was enabled you to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say in a few different ways. I think there is something around the symptom management piece, if we come back to that, which is, an experience of nervous system dysregulation in the form of stress, anxiety, is a very noisy internal landscape. And when it's a very noisy internal landscape that's very head driven, your connection to intuition, that inner guidance system, the wisdom that lives within all of us, is drowned out by that static and that noise that anxiety and the nervous system can create. And so I think in part that connection to that, or that reconnection to that, would stem from there, where we're actually clearing away a lot of that internal clutter, that internal noise, to be able to start to listen again. So that for me is almost living within the micro level of breath work, where we're working with the breath day to day to work with our system, to work with our respiratory system, to work with our nervous system. And then we have this sort of macro end of these therapeutic applications of breath work and these explorations of these not ordinary psychedelic adjacent experiences that we can create through the breath. And through those experiences, which make up a big part of my own journey with breathwork and also my work today, we really can start to connect to these expanded states of consciousness. People often report these experiences of ego dissolution, of dissolution of linear time, of what they call in the world of psychedelics oceanic boundlessness, which is sort of unity consciousness and oneness. And through that, there for me in my own journey was a deep connection to spirituality, a real deep connection to something beyond myself that gives purpose, that gives meaning in life, and also a really deep connection to that core aspect of myself or my soul. So yeah, it's why I find the breath, so fascinating even to this day, and more so the more I learn, the more intrigued I am, because we can look at it as so incredibly simple and fundamental, and yet there are so many different ways that we can engage with it that can give us different things, whether it's regulating the nervous system in the moment acutely, or whether it's really diving deep into what it is to be alive and what it is to be conscious.
So you're the kind of breathwork you're talking about, when I've always thought about breathwork or have heard about breathwork, or people they've always told me that it needs to be a practice, something that is done daily. Is this something that you agree with? Or because I can't imagine you have to do the kind of intense psychedelic experiences on a daily basis. I think that would be overwhelming for most people's systems. So how does the way you work with the breath, well, work, I guess?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you shared there. My mission through my work is, at its core, I believe that we need to restore breath as an integrated part of how we live our lives, an integrated part of the fabric of our culture, rather than an isolated modality. But we have to, given the way our system is set up, go through that sort of putting it in a box and helping people understand it before it can return to what I view as its rightful place. So it's more of an integrated life philosophy than an isolated technique or modality. That being said, the way that I approach it as a modality through my work at this point in time is through that lens of the micro and the macro. So the micro is the daily practice of breath awareness, functional breathing day to day, and nervous system regulation. And those things give us the capacity and the resources internally to be able to hold those deeper experiences. And it's really about, how do you have that deeper experience in a way that is possible to integrate and hold fully And also, those micro practices are what help you integrate those deeper experiences. So it creates this lovely cyclical approach of micro and macro where we lay the foundations. We then, if it feels appropriate, go and explore the depths, but in a way where we can actually hold the material that emerges, because that's a big question mark, I think, around the therapeutic applications of breathwork and also the therapeutic applications of psychedelics. You know, it's very powerful. Nobody's questioning that. But how do we support people in holding those experiences? And that's where the daily practice needs to come into the fold.
I've got two then follow-up questions to that, because I'd love to know more about what conscious connected breath work is. So that this kind of macro, I guess, is the piece, and then these daily practices. Would you encourage people to have learned about the daily practices and be doing that day to day before they kind of dip their toes into the kind of macro conscious connected breathwork sessions? Or is that, how would you look at that?
In an ideal world, I would say most people would be best served from a safety and a responsibility and probably an efficacy perspective to go about it that way. However, as I sort of shared earlier, I didn't, and I know lots of people that haven't, and I'm still here, I'm doing okay. And I think that's also where my safety hat kind of comes on alongside my enthusiasm hat, which is to say, realistically, breathwork is one of the most accessible tools for self-regulation and consciousness transformation that we are currently aware of, probably the single most accessible. And so long as you aren't stepping into that deep experience with any pre-existing medical contraindications that any good facilitator should make you aware of, and also not stepping into it from a place of feeling really destabilized before you even enter the practice. If you've had a bit of a stressful day and you're someone who has a bit of anxiety time to time, I could say with 90% plus certainty that you will have an experience that won't completely wipe you out at the knees. And so in an ideal world, I would always want to sort of support someone in understanding what is a good place to be entering into those spaces from, but it's for the majority of people a safe practice to engage in, regardless of your pre-existing experience.
I just had my partner went to a breathwork session in London not long ago, and he said he's a big breathwork advocate. He does a lot. He has a daily practice, and it's been really helpful in his own recovery. He suffers from serious anxiety. I think it's pretty similar to what you kind of described. Even though he has his daily practice, I think this particular session was extremely intense and really deep, and it really triggered a whole period for a week of really raw anxiety, really scary feelings. And he didn't quite, until he went to therapy like the week later, he hadn't quite pieced together the fact that that breath work, because he came out of the breathwork session being like, oh my God, that was amazing. I feel incredible. That was wow. And then the week went on and he was really anxious and really struggling. And only when he went into therapy then did he connect the things.
So and if I can build on that,
please,
can I just build on that with what I was just thinking as you were talking through all of that, is that my own experience of anxiety is that it's often a loss of control of the breath. And so actually being in a gentle control and being in relation with breath in a non-extreme is actually the foundation for me to feel safe enough to then explore further. So I completely hear you on the opportunity it represents at scale for change, which is much needed and often overlooked. You know, the simple tools are often the ones that don't get the kind of attention or that seems to be the shiny new thing. At the same time of just noticing that difference between where someone might start, and the anxiety can actually be perpetuated by that. What actually happens physiologically when you get into that state of anxiety, and then the opportunity of going further with a breathwork practice to get that insight, to have those bigger releases, or whatever language you would use. And so mental, whether it's about clinical application of psychedelics, I'm always going to come from this from a very cautious and optimistic place. So it's similar sort of thing is like, if we don't really understand the power of something, we've got to really approach it with some level of caution.
I completely agree. And it's such an important conversation. I put out an article on Monday on my Substack that was essentially, it was called The Myth of Intensity, and essentially why maximum intensity and conscious connected breathwork isn't always the answer. And if I was going to go a little stronger, it's rarely the answer. The reason And it's interesting what you shared, Araminta, as well around your partner's experience, because what I shared about how I would approach these things is very much in accordance with how I approach conscious connected breathwork, which is a much gentler tempo and intensity than what some of the other ways of approaching that style of breathwork are. The reason, and one of the really interesting things about the recent research, is that there's a study that came out that said the lower you drop your blood CO2 levels, your end tidal CO2 levels in the body, the more pronounced the altered state of consciousness through breathwork will be. And looking at that in isolation, you would therefore go, breathe faster, breathe harder, breathe higher intensity, and you'll have a bigger experience. Now, I have a whole separate conversation for us to have about the nature of escapism in the wellness world, and actually how a lot of these practices are just used for temporary escape rather than meaningful change. But what we also see through the lived experience and facilitation of conscious connected breathwork is that end tidal CO2 levels are the first physiological domino that set off the cascade of an experience in conscious connected breathwork. However, the second side of the coin is psychological safety and ego capacity. And if an individual doesn't have the resources or capacity or skills and techniques and tools to hold a profound experience, then we run the risk of re-traumatization, we run the risk of overwhelm, of collapse within the psyche. And that's where, with psychedelics and breathwork, we have to be incredibly intentional and incredibly safe. That being said, I think the beautiful middle ground with breathwork is a gentle approach to conscious connected breathwork with correct preparation and integration, so that during the experience you are using kind of terms like pendulation and titration to take someone into a little bit of an altered state and a little bit of intensity and activation, and then they come out again. And it's retraining the individual's psyche, nervous system, and state to trust that kind of intensity, to trust that kind of material and recalibrate their relationship with it.
The window of tolerance, right? That's the whole, the pendulation and the titration is you've got this window of tolerance when your nervous system, as any human being in daily life, you're going to come out of it. You're going to go either into overwhelm or you're going into collapse. And I've always thought and known is actually that you will get stuck and into either kind of depression if you're in collapse, or kind of anxiety if you're in the overwhelm, overactive state. But because we're all going in and out of that, the point is to come back into that window of tolerance. The point is to be able to get used to. So it's almost like a muscle. If you're doing something that actually kind of builds that muscle of understanding that actually I can come out of it and come back into it, and you feel safe enough to then, when you are faced with a situation in the real world that puts you in either an anxious state or in a state of collapse, you are able then to bring yourself back into that window of tolerance.
Exactly. And there's a brilliant colleague of mine, a guy called Martin McPhillamy, based in Australia, who brings a lot of theory around predictive processing into the conversation of conscious connected breathwork, and actually saying we actually want to intentionally, in a safely wrapped container, create a prediction error in the brain. The brain is a prediction machine. If it is predicting, oh, I'm in a safe space, and therefore I feel calm and comfortable, but then how you're breathing creates a level of anxiety, and therefore, or not anxiety necessarily, but activation, and creates that prediction error. But you're then able, as you said, Araminta, to recontextualize that, recalibrate that response, bring yourself back to a level of grounding, a level of resourcing, a level of capacity. Then that is creating a new prediction pathway where that discomfort shows up outside of your container, outside of the breathwork space, you are then finding a different path through that. And I think that's a really fascinating approach, and something, again, that we're going to continue to learn more about in the context of these altered states through breathwork.
I do like the fact that you're speaking to the need for guidance and somebody to walk you through this process, because I think in this world there are so many that we know from all of the conversations that there are no silver bullets. There's a whole suite there's a toolkit of parts, and this for me is always, whether you're on those early stages of just kind of the first dipping your toe into understanding how breath affects your state, physical and mental, or whether you're then using the breath to access deeper levels of conscious awareness or insight. But it is an education process. We've lost this innate wisdom, and therefore we have to kind of reconnect back into that. And it's not just a simple case of follow this this video, and I, because I worry for some of those holotropic breath practices that I see, the same as I worry for the huge opportunity and potential that psychedelics has for us. But when I'm just going to kind of like do some MDMA and hope for some insight, that's not how. It's the preparation, it's the dosage, it's the integration, it's understanding how long. I mean, I don't know. I'd be really interested in how long the developmental window is opened after you get into that state, because we know for some psychedelics like ibogaine, that can last up to 6 months. For others, it's very short. And so the integration has to be reflective of how long we're in that kind of open state. So I don't, I guess I'm not really got a question, more just an observation of the parallels I'm drawing to that space and the importance of safety and protocols and proper counsel and coaching through that.
Yeah, it's something I find really interesting and emergent at the moment, which is it's almost hard for our brains or our psyches to hold breath, which on one hand is so simple. People, whatever, with how profound the shifts and the experiences can be. Even as a facilitator, I think I'm likely to fall into that at times where I'm like, it's breathing. But actually, the more we learn, and we'll continue to learn about those kind of windows, of plasticity afterwards, about what's really going on a psychological and a somatic level with these practices. There's some amazing people doing brilliant research at the moment, but it's so nascent. It's so novel, and I'm just fascinated to see how it continues to unfold alongside and complementary to the psychedelic therapy world, because I'm a huge proponent. I've been talking to Rayanne and the guys at Imperial about this, around how do we integrate this as either preparation or integration or whatever it might be. And I know a lot of the retreat centers and organizations in the Netherlands and elsewhere around the world do have this sort of staged approach of these deeper breathwork practices prior to medicine work. And I think it's something that we'll continue to see open up over the next few years.
Yeah, me too. I'm really fascinated by it. And Minty knows I'm like the control freak in me will never let me go to any psychedelics, but I am interested and fascinated by the concept of getting close to that kind of experience through breath. It feels a lot more accessible to me.
And that's the beauty of it, I think. And that's what is music to my ears, because I do think there is, whether it's someone who is fixated on the legality of it, or whether it's someone who doesn't feel safe with that, who has sort of prior negative experiences with drugs in their youth, or whatever it might be, breath does provide this middle ground, because you are ultimately always in control of it. And it is, you can get off the roller coaster in a way that you can't with psychedelics.
Sometimes, yes, and I think sometimes you might be able to. I think, I've never done connected breath work, but I have done holotropic breath work, and I think it's just as intense as any psychedelic trip I've ever done, really. Like, I mean, certainly probably more intense than sort of psilocybin.
You're talking me out of it now.
Yeah.
I'm out.
Well, I think this is important as to the delivery mechanism and the facilitation, because holotropic, one of the kind of OG schools of Western altered state breathwork and high ventilation breathwork from Stan Grof, it's like 90 minutes to 3 hours of forceful hyperventilation. And, that study I spoke to earlier, that will get you somewhere pretty profound. And there was a study that came out in 2023 that found that conscious connected breathwork can create mystical states on par with medium to high doses of psilocybin. So it's yes, a stepping stone, but it's also on par in lots of ways. And that's where I think our continued education and understanding of the nervous system state, the setting, the facilitation of these experiences will probably, I hope, or my personal opinion, will steer us towards a slightly more measured, gentle approach that honors the psychological safety and nervous system state aspect a little bit more than just breathe as hot and heavy as you can for 3 hours and see where you can blast off to, because it doesn't seem perhaps as fully informed as it could, and whilst obviously being well intentioned and for the most part kind of well held as well.
I want to be respectful of time, but I've got so many more questions. Like, why does it achieve that? Is it because it gets us close to death and we have all the reasons? What is it? Is it because it's what's the mechanism to access in that level of insight that is induced by if I could understand the science of it, then that would help me,
A very brief version, which is caveated by saying we're still learning about what's really going on. But that first domino, as we create high ventilation or controlled hyperventilation or cyclic hyperventilation, we're lowering CO2 levels. That is kind of literally the first domino. We get decrease in cerebral blood flow. So we actually get tissue and brain hypoxia. And there was actually, I was making notes before we came on some of the recent research, but there was a reduction in blood flow to the posterior insula and the left operculum, which are involved in our embodied sense of self. So these feelings of unity, these feelings of oneness and oceanic boundlessness, increases in activity in the amygdala and interior hippocampus associated with processing of emotionally salient memories. So we're sort of getting emotional processing coming up. We're also getting a sense of self coming down, and this sort of merging underpinned by changes in oxygenation of the brain and blood flow to the brain. The one-liner that I've always come back to is that it creates a trance-like hypnotic state where unconscious material can be surfaced. So it's kind of turning down of the dial on finite mind, increasing the dial of infinite and that connection to deeper consciousness. But we're learning more every single day.
And when you describe it like that, it kind of draws parallels to me. It's like a hypnotic state, like being able to quieten down the conscious mind and get into a subconscious deep state where you can kind of cue and you can pull forward, or you can set suggestions that are favorable or helpful in healing. So many questions. I could definitely keep going, but I want to respect our time today, and I apologize again for my slight technology issues, but we got there in the end. Yeah, it was a pleasure to meet you, Jamie. Thank you for joining us today. I can't wait to welcome you at Oxford. I am super excited from the conversation that we've had today, and I'm going to try and make sure that I am not scheduled during that workshop so I can come and be part of that.
Yeah, well, obviously we didn't kind of bring this onto air, but before Jamie joined, Jamie and I were talking about his workshop in Oxford, which is we're hoping to bring together kind of a couple of hundred people in an embodied space to do a breathwork session, which I think will be really amazing at Oxford, because the energy of such a large group together to do something like that for 90 minutes, I think will be fascinating. So yeah, Jamie, I'm really looking forward to that in Oxford too.
Me too. I think it'd be special. And just to add to that as well, I think there's something that always takes place when there is a pre-existing level of trait openness, curiosity, and intellectual understanding, which obviously your audience are naturally attuned to that kind of curiosity around these things, which for me is one of the key factors in someone then really being able to drop into an experience of this style of breathwork. So yeah, very excited for it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jamie. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Bye.